Namaste. As a part of our series, Open Conversations, today we discuss the myth of science, hatred, corruption, and limitedness. Most of us look at science as something pure, rational, and away from ordinary human pathos of emotion and corruption. But is it really so? Or is science as compromised as all other structures in society? Let us discuss this topic with our psychoanalysis consultant, Mr. Himanshu Vaidya. Namaste, Mr. Vaidya. Mr. Vaidya, people believe two things about science. One, that is pure and it is incorruptible. And second, it is certain and infallible. Is it really so? I mean, can we begin with what is corruption in science?
It's true. People believe that science is exact and infallible. People worship science. And this activity of worshipping science is a religious activity, not a scientific activity. The religious activity is in the sense that the scientists become the priesthood. The laws of science become the religious book. And the knowledge of science becomes God. And laboratories become Mount Sinai where revelations happen. So it is not actually a scientific activity, it is a religious activity. Shelley's lines come to our mind, a worship of that something afar from the spheres of our sorrow. It is that kind of an activity. There are four elements to science which make us realize that this worship is unfounded and actually we are worshipping false gods. That is not to say that there is nothing to science or that pursuit of science itself is unwarranted. That is not the extreme we are trying to propose. What we are trying to propose is that science is something very valuable. Our knowledge and our quality of life and our survival and much of human progress is because of science. However, it is not an infallible entity. So between being good for nothing and between being omnipotent, the truth is somewhere in between. And because at present, omnipotence is ruling minds of people related to science, we are trying to bring the mistaken notions back to the zone of reality. When we do so, we realize there are four elements to science which are not appreciated by people in general, except those who are deeply involved in science or deeply involved in philosophy. There are four elements which are very important. First, corruption related to science. Second, fallibility of science. Third, hatred in science. And fourth, limitedness of science. And when we examine in details all these four aspects related to science, we realize that it is not something rock solid, it is not something absolute, it is not something which is a gold standard to anything. But like all other entities that are found in human existence, this also has its own limitations and its own utility. And the truth is between the extremes. With this in mind, we come to conclude that science, like any other discipline or any other area of knowledge, cannot be unaffected by the limitedness, weakness, and corruption of the human being who is handling that science. And therefore, there is no way a scientific activity can 100% be a scientific activity unaffected by the weaknesses of the scientist or the person or the technologist who is involved in the process. There is no way that pure science can be done in a pure way, no matter whom we are looking at in question. So this background is good enough for us to get into the problems of science. But before we do it, one more point. When people talk about the uh, infallibility and exactness of science, they have a mistaken notion of what is science. And here we have to get into a slight depth of how people look at the word science.
Yes.
For example, if we look at science in three areas, we have physical sciences, life sciences, and mind and many mind sciences, which we call humanities and social sciences. So you can divide the whole of science into these three categories. Now, humanities and social sciences never make a claim to be exact and unchanging. And people who are involved in it never feel that their science is actually an exact, infallible science. Similarly, people in the area of life sciences also realize that science has its limitations not only in terms of many other areas of reach and predictability, but also in areas of exactness. So people in the area of life sciences also don't make this claim of science being very exact and unchanging and absolute over time. Similarly, people in the area of physical sciences also don't make this claim, because in physical sciences, if you talk of weather sciences, they involve high degree of probability. If you talk of geology, they involve high degree of probability and high degree of fallibility. If you talk of paleontosciences, again the same thing, high degree of fallibility, high degree of variability. When people say science is exact and unchanging over time, usually they have in mind one small element of science, which is what we call everyday physics of science. So when we go to physical sciences, and within physical sciences, when we go to physics, we look at three areas of physics. That area which deals with very small quantities in quantum mechanics. That area of physics which deals with very large quantities in cosmology. And the middle ground of physics which deals with everyday physics as we know it. It is only in the area of everyday physics that even in physics we find exactness and sort of long-term durability of principles. If within physics also we go to cosmology, which deals with very large entities, and quantum mechanics dealing with very small entities, again, neither exactness nor durability of principles is at play. So when people have this idea in general, and most people have this idea that science is exact and durable, they actually have an idea, one very small part of the whole world of science, which is everyday physics. It's even in physics, they are not talking about the quantum physics or the cosmology. So neither in humanities and social sciences, nor in life sciences, nor even in physical sciences, not even within pure physics, dealing with very small or very large quantities, this idea of exactness and endurance over time is at play. It's only in a very small area of everyday physics, the classical physics, that this idea holds. So this is a correction that has to be brought about. Unfortunately, most people don't think through in details. So they have ideas about one small area of science, the classical physics of everyday, and they generalize it for the whole of science. And that is where the mistaken notions of exactness and endurance of principles of science, these come about, and these ideas lead to the worship of science.
Mr. Vaidya, like from what you shared, it sounds like kind of clashing with a common man's understanding of science, as you said, the day-to-day science, which is like a kind of perfect and unchangeable, unfallible kind of, or something very certain.
Right.
So can you just tell us your understanding of the word itself, what science is? I mean, because that itself creates this whole image of science being perfect, science being infallible, science being unchangeable, and 100% objective.
Right. So this question brings about what is the different types of knowledge that we have? What are the different kinds of knowledge that we have? So human mind has this characteristic of asking questions and trying to find answers. And at times it succeeds in finding answers. And these answers put together is what we call our storehouse of knowledge. And this storehouse of knowledge has many entities in the storehouse. So there is a knowledge of the philosophic type. There is this knowledge which is, the philosophic knowledge is very inexact. It deals with those entities which cannot be tested in the laboratory. For example, you can try to study in the laboratory how immune system functions in the body. But if you try to ask this question, why should immune system exist in the first place? That is a philosophical question, not a scientific question. You can study how the brain functions by studying the neurology in laboratory. But if you ask the question, why should brain exist in the first place? That is a philosophical question. It cannot be studied in the laboratory. So it can be studied only in what Indian psychology says, in the world of words. You can explore this question only in the world of words. You can't explore these questions in any laboratory setting. So there are questions which are of philosophical type and there are questions which are of scientific type. So when we put different types of knowledge together, we have one group of knowledge that we call philosophical knowledge. Then we have, which just can't be tested. Then we have something called art, knowledge about art, which is very inexactly known. Then we move from art to craft, something slightly more exactly known, but still largely inexact. Then we move to inexact sciences of the type that we have in humanities and social sciences. And then we move to exact sciences where the deterministic element, the predictable element, the exactness and accuracy becomes high. And then we move to automation. When we know something so well that we can manualize it, then we can automate it and then we can give it to robots to function. So this is this whole journey of knowledge, starting from philosophical type of knowledge to artistic knowledge, to craft kind of knowledge, to inexact sciences, to exact sciences, to a mastery of the level that we can manualize and automate it. So this is the whole journey of science. Now in this whole journey, there is something which is called the method of science. And the method of science is that the knowledge which is generated using the method of science should be objective and verifiable by different people and should always produce the same result. So to prove something, you have to keep proving it all the time, but to disprove something, even one disproval is enough. So this is what is called, there is something called the method of science, that it should be repeatable, it should be verifiable, it should be independent of the person who does it. And the process of science is very clear that it has to be done using either certain instruments or it has to be done using certain statistical instruments, but those things have to be as objective as possible. And you should also always satisfy the need of verifiability by different people at different places. So scientific knowledge pertains to that class of knowledge which is generated using the methods of science. So that does not mean that knowledge which cannot be put to scrutiny using the method of science is wrong. It may just be that science is not equipped at this moment to process certain classes of knowledge using its method of science. So what is not scientific knowledge is not necessarily untrue. but definitely it is not scientific knowledge. So we have to make a distinction between true knowledge and scientific knowledge. One part of true knowledge which can be processed through the scientific method is what we call the scientific knowledge. So there the degree of reliability, validity is very high. Does not mean what has not been verified through that method as essentially is wrong. Right? And there is a second aspect which will lead us to the next question of corruption in science, that this method of science itself is not incorruptible. So we have to put a caveat there that while the method of science is very reliable, and it has given us this whole edifice of science and all the benefits of science, but that method of science is not 100% infallible, and at the hands of people who are having weaknesses or corruption in themselves, this method of science can also be selectively used for non-beneficial purposes. And this method of science itself is susceptible to all the limitations of human beings. And this brings us to the next question, I think, of the corruption in science, which we'll deal with at length.
Yeah, so that's my next question. How does corruption get into science?
Corruption gets into science in various ways. Let us take a few examples. The generic thing is, if the person who is creating knowledge or using knowledge himself has some weaknesses, then science cannot be saved from those weaknesses. Let us look at some examples. First, let us look at the medical part of doing false tests. So let us say somebody is doing a medical test of somebody's blood sugar, and he shows more sugar than exactly it is there, just to push that person towards medication. So the pharmaceutical company and the doctor and the pathology lab all get together to use those tests where the errors are more on the positive side, and they get into false testing. So you can have corruption seen in false testing or repeatedly unwanted testing. You are in hospital and unnecessarily keep testing you every day because they want to make money. Then we have something called selective marketing, that the pharmaceutical companies give out some part of information and don't give out other part of information. And this typically has to do with the side effects or adverse drug reactions. So that scientific information is never given out, and the regulatory bodies also are compromised. So the regulatory bodies also don't bring out because they themselves are corrupt. The government, which is supposed to set straight the regulatory body, itself is corrupt on the payrolls of the pharma companies. So it leads us to the situation, if the salt has lost its flavor, where shall it be salted? If the ultimate arbitrators, ultimate controllers themselves go corrupt, how do you save yourself and where do you go? So this is a very big element of corruption in science, where the regulatory bodies, the government and the judiciary itself is corrupted, and therefore wrong science happens or wrong science is not exposed. And therefore you often have a blockbuster drug which 10 years down the line you find has huge side effects. So take an example, a new blockbuster drug is launched and within 3 years some side effects are seen, but deliberately they are suppressed. And the process of recalling a drug is so cumbersome that 5 years pass before it happens, and in that process the company has already minted money, but the social damage to patients is huge. So this is what happens when science gets corrupted. So this is one instance of science getting corrupted. Now the second instance is, what kind of research happens? For example, you will have medical research is focused on everything that happens in the developed world, but nobody is interested in sicknesses which are peculiar only to the developing world. So the developed countries' governments will spend billions of dollars trying to understand what happens in the galaxy 150 light years away from us, but they won't put money in researching cure for malaria, which is actually a disease of the poor world. So this is because of a kind of uh, uh, a corruption by omission, where unless there are profits, you don't prioritize certain priorities in science. So that's second element. The third element is the outcome of research. There is a joke in the research community that the outcome of research depends upon who commissions the research. So this is where you select such sample sizes, such sample frames, you select such samples, you select such statistical techniques that ultimately you prove what you want to prove. So that is another element that corruption in science leads to, that instead of science, this is actually a kind of a feeder into commercial interests. Then you have suppression of sciences which do not fit the commercial interests. For example, research related to homeopathy, Ayurveda, indigenous medication, shamanic healing, alternative healing like Reiki and pranic healing, all those researches are suppressed or not done because it clashes with the commercial interest. So all these are elements of where corruption gets into science. Take for example the way WHO has functioned in the COVID crisis. It suppressed information. It did not give authorization to many candidates of vaccines in time. And the idea was that, and the pretext was that there somebody is not giving right data and so on and so forth. And entire world, there was a hue and cry about WHO. Every prescription of WHO over a period of time proved wrong. But before it proved wrong, billions of dollars already was spent by customers. So actually we need a Patients Justice Commission in every country to really go into this medical aspect of corruption in science, in medical science in particular, and in general, we need an oversight body to go into this whole aspect of corruption in science, which happens at various levels. And not only the corruption that people do in buying of scientific instruments and so on, that's a very ordinary corruption. We are talking of more sophisticated corruption, which happens in an intellectual zone by commission or omission.
From like what we have shared so far, it sounds like science is not as objective as we think, or it's like 100% objective and free from all human emotions or other things. So it has subjectivity, positive, negative, whatever, but it definitely has subjectivity.
Yes, yes, it is true. It is not a rock solid mountain where a drop of water can't get it. In fact, there are 100 leakages in the system.
Right. Yeah. So that takes us to our next question. Going to human emotion of hatred, how does it play out in the world of science?
The emotion of hatred also is a very important emotion that plays out in science, in the world of science, which takes away the idea of absolute objectivity and absolute fairness of science. Right? And this plays out in 4 different ways. There is something which is called hatred in pure science, hatred in social sciences, hatred in the institutional area of sciences, and hatred based upon certain social groups, say the homosexual lesbian group at present. or other ideological groups. So science plays, the hatred element in science plays out at these four categories. Let's take them one by one. The first is the hatred that you have playing out in the area of pure science is very paradoxically. Because in pure science, we believe the psychological component should not play out so much.
Yes.
Right? But it does. For example, at present, there is a very large community of scientists who are invested philosophically in the idea of materialism and reductionism. And therefore, they have quite an amount of hatred, which they just call disagreement in politically correct language, but many of them actually have hatred towards the other group, which is believing in God or consciousness or non-reductionist holistic sciences. So it's very difficult to be in an institute or a laboratory which is dominated by people with materialistic opinions for somebody with non-materialistic opinions to survive there. And when it comes to allocation of budgets, when it comes to printing something in research papers, when it comes to organizing of conferences, what subject you should organize on, this hatred plays out. And in fact, it's not uncommon to see in group discussions, one group shouting down the other based on very tribal majority kind of a situation where the majority just shouts down the other by brute force of its numbers and shouting capability. And this you see even in conferences, in panel discussions everywhere. So there is a very strong element of hatred which plays out in pure sciences also. Let us look at the second element of hatred playing out in social sciences. That I think is an area where it plays out the maximum. This element of hatred. And it's very common to see institutes being either completely on the left or completely on the right of the ideological spectrum, and the other group finds it very difficult to survive. So in India, we have many universities known for being extremely left, and it's virtually impossible for a person with right view or right-wing ideological view to survive there. So it's not only that there is an omission of support, but there is a very positive persecution. You actually have traps laid out to throw people out of the institutes. So the hatred does not just remain ideological, it becomes quite personal. And therefore it is like fall in line or get out. And that is the situation in most social science institutes, that they are either one way or the other. There are very few institutes where you have a sense of fairness and balance and different ideologies are respected. So this whole notion that universities are ideas of free discussion is an idealistic notion marketed by universities. It's not actually true in practice. In practice, universities and research institutions are either one way, and it's difficult for the other party to survive. That is in the social sciences. Third is the institutional hatred or the ideological hatred, where institutes hate each other for taking certain positions or competing with each other. So two institutions in the area of science competing with each other or taking different ideological positions or a completely different position on a scientific issue and presenting it to the government for funding, this raises very strong institutional hatred. And then you have the hatred because of certain beliefs and groups. So if you look at the Homo Lesbo group today, the Homo Lesbo group within the scientific community has a very intense hatred towards those who are straight. And all kinds of political events happen on this axis, where not only does this group prevent conservative researchers or conservative opinionated people from functioning in their institutes, but they positively try to create a narrative which is against the conservative narrative. So they are not in search of science, they are in search of ideological validation. So this is not science, this is like a selective application of science for ideological purposes. So you see hatred being played out in science in a macro way in these four areas. Of course, person to person hatred is always there.
A lot of weightage is given to peer reviews. Now, like, is the peer-reviewed blind review journals kind of the greatest scandal going on these days?
Yes, very rightly said. In fact, there is a pandemic, a global pandemic of compromised journals. And it's very important to understand this fact because it goes to the very roots of what is wrong with science. So this brings us to the element why journals are so important. And that is because uh, when somebody brings out some scientific knowledge, the whole question is, how do you put that scientific knowledge to test? So one way to do it is to do the experiment in laboratory. And the second way, if you cannot reproduce the laboratory experiment, or let us say in social sciences, laboratory experiments are not possible, then what you do is what is called peer review, which means the person who has created the knowledge puts up this knowledge for peer review by experts. And here we believe in the idea of collective wisdom, that a peer group cannot go wrong. And when the peer group is doing some review and it validates claim by some scientist, then that knowledge is accepted as knowledge peer reviewed in blind review. And that knowledge then gets published in journals. And when something is published in a journal which is based upon blind peer review, then people believe that that knowledge is very objective, very fair, unbiased, and therefore it's accepted as true objective scientific knowledge. When that knowledge does not get a strong rebuttal, then over a period of time, it gets established as scientific knowledge, and that then comes into textbooks. In the textbooks, through textbooks, it gets into the whole of the society. And the whole of the society then gets positively informed or indoctrinated based upon what is the content of science, content of that knowledge. Now, in this whole arena, the journals are the gatekeepers of knowledge. They are the ones who decide which knowledge should be allowed to pass through the gate and which knowledge should be stopped. And in scientific jargon, we call here the two concepts of two errors. One error the journal can make is to not allow true knowledge to pass, which we call type 1 error. And second error that can happen at the gatekeeper's point is they allow false knowledge to pass as true knowledge, which we call error number 2. Right? So in any selection of knowledge, whenever you are presented with 10 different elements of knowledge, you can have any of these two errors. But the third error is the error of intention. So we believe that these two type of errors, type 1 error and type 2 error, happen unintentionally. But there is an intention error. And this is what people don't talk about. And this is where we have to focus. That unfortunately today, peer-reviewed journals, they are the gatekeepers of knowledge. And unless something passes through them, society at large does not get to know it. But these gatekeepers have become biased. So there is a problem at the very genesis of science. It is like if you are trying to filter water, but the filter itself is infected with bacteria, the water that you get on the output cannot be pure water, because the filter itself is infected. This is what is the situation is, that the gatekeepers themselves are infected. And there are some very interesting incidents around it. First, to prove this, that the gatekeepers themselves are compromised and they are as fallen as human beings can be, there have been some very dramatic incidents. First incident is related to the area of pure science. There was a scientist, I think it's called Shanks Kendall or something. I forget the name of the scientist. What he did was he produced a paper in which he wrote very well in good language. He quoted all the right people, made all the politically correct statements, and then put in something which he knew was rubbish. And he gave it to very reputed journals to publish, and some of them published it. And after it was published, he exposed the journals by saying, what I have written is rubbish. I know it's rubbish. I did it only to check out how fair and objective and academically rigorous the peer-reviewed journal system is. So these are the flaws. And then he did an experiment on a larger scale. He got a group of people who started publishing papers which they knew were rubbish. But they quoted all the right people, got all the quotations, they got very reputed people as co-authors, and these things got published. And before they were caught, they were able to publish in almost 12 to 14 different journals. Which means after publishing in 12 journals, the first journal actually caught them. So it tells us that for every 12 journals which can be fooled, you have one journal who cannot be fooled. So it is 8:1. So less than 12% of the journals are really accurate. And 92% of the journals are either compromised or easily can be fooled. A similar experiment was done in the social sciences area, even in psychoanalysis, where one person wrote something which had no academic value, nothing new in it. It was just a reproduction of already known. But he wrote it well and got it published, and then called the bluff of the journal saying this was all rubbish that you published. So these kind of exposing the journals have happened again and again, these incidents. And now we have a situation where the gatekeepers, which is the editors and the reviewers, who are the gatekeepers of the journals, they themselves are compromised ideologically. So they allow only certain kinds of papers to pass and certain kinds of papers not to pass. Certain authors to publish and certain authors not to publish. And this has gone to such a level of bias that now people who are frustrated are actually creating new journals. And therefore, this whole thing of blind peer reviewed journals as being the gold standard is no longer true. People know they are ideologically biased. People know all the four weaknesses that we talked about: corruption, hatred, fallibility, and limitedness. All the four are at work. And there is a problem at the very roots of the whole system. The gatekeepers themselves have turned corrupt, not in the financial sense, but in different areas. So you can also see in medical research how difficult it is for an Indian company which is producing vaccine to get itself published, and how easy it is for a big multinational company to get its results published. We saw that in the COVID pandemic also. So this whole area is compromised, and this requires a fundamental rethink, that possibly we have to bring some legislation in India and in most countries whereby the tenured professors who are ideologically on one side and persecutory to the other side are removed. And there is an ideological balance and fairness in all systems of academics and all these peer-reviewed journals. And we should have people from all walks of life to make sure that this ideological neutrality and objectivity and fairness is maintained in academics and in peer-reviewed journals.
Again, from as more and more we are sharing about the loopholes of science or the weaknesses of science, it kind of shakes or shatters our faith in science as something omnipotent or something as or something we worship or respect or whatever blindly.
So this
So
brings
in that case, yeah,
so this brings us to the psychoanalytic phenomena of how we project omnipotence on everyone.
yes. So whether it is God or science, it's just a projection.
Yeah. Yeah. But in reality, nothing is infallible. Nothing is omnipotent.
Right. So in that sense, then what price do we pay for this corruption and hatred in science?
We pay a very heavy price at every level of human life. If the difficulties of science were just academic in nature, we won't have to bother. It would just be an issue of professors, researchers, and publishers. But unfortunately, it's a real issue for you and me. So we pay the price of these difficulties in science at every level. First, let us take up the medical level. In the area of medical sciences, we all of us pay the price. Just look at how easy it is to pass a drug for mass consumption and how difficult it is to take it back. So we have all seen the blockbuster of today, 10 years down the line is banned. You just go from one extreme to the other. How was it possible? Unless the evaluation procedure itself was too relaxed. Take, for example, our opinions on some medical issues. Say, for example, the issue of getting burnt. It's a very painful situation if you suffer from any burn. A few years back, medical community was convinced that if you get burnt, don't put water onto it. Because if you put water, it will create those wide blisters and they are not good for healing. So they would say, do anything but don't put water. Put sand, put a blanket, but don't put water. When intuitively everyone felt like putting water on burns. It was our instinctual response. It was our instinctual natural knowledge. Any animal does that. You burn any animal, it will go into water. But medical science said this was not to be done. And if you look at journals of those times, you will find all the journal articles there who would prove using a very empirical, double-blinded statistical technique how water should not be used over burns. And 10 to 15 years after that, now we have in the same medical journals articles which say whatever happens if you get burned, the first thing you do is apply water. And when the blisters forms, it's a good sign because it's a good thing for healing. Now, 10 years back, if you had said that naturally my instinct tells me I should put water, and when I put water, I observe that I heal quickly rather if I don't put water. So they would have thrown all these journals on your face. That it's your opinion versus this journal opinion, and you would not stand a chance. But today, the same journals, exactly opposite articles are being published. Now, if I put these two journals together, a journal of 10 years back and the same journal today, both of which publish exactly opposite articles. Now, what is the guarantee that this situation will not happen for anything that is published today? And the question is, before it was found that water is good for burns, because of the wrong knowledge published in the journals, how many people have suffered and who is going to compensate them? Should there not be a patient justice commission to make people who make others suffer, the gatekeepers, should they not be held accountable? Because it was the gatekeepers of those journals who are responsible for those wrong articles getting published. It was the editors and the reviewers who were responsible. Why are they not persecuted? Same thing for drugs. When a drug is allowed to be used and 10 years down the line we find the drug has so much side effects that we ban the drug, why are the people in the regulatory authority not persecuted who allowed the drugs to go? So we pay a huge price Many people die, many people lose their life and limbs, many people lose their near and dear ones, many people lose their entire income of the life because of the problems in academic journals, because of the corruption in science, fallibility of people, and so on in the medical area. So there's a huge price in the medical area. Take, for example, this whole idea of drinking 10 glasses of water every day. The only people who benefited out of this was not people, ordinary people, but the mineral water companies. People ended up with overloading their kidneys and going to the hospitals. So this is the medical price that we pay for the 4 limitations we talked about, particularly corruption. Then come to the social area. In the social area, the researches are such that they back a particular narrative, the narrative of individualism, narrative of hedonism, the narrative of homo lesbo rights, the narratives which are manufactured by universities abroad. And the social price for that is huge because nobody is ready to research and communicate the benefits of the conservative point of view. Not only it is not discussed, it's not even allowed to surface in those journals. Take the whole idea of family and social capital and how quickly it has been suppressed by everyone who believes in hedonism and individualism. So when it comes to social organization, when it comes to formats of living, when it comes to sustainability of social structures, no research is allowed to be published or at least get popular if it is against this lobby which believes in individualism and hedonism. So there is a huge social price for this. Then we come to the political aspect. When we cannot debate the natural things, for example, let's say eugenics, the science of genes and genetics, how to create better individuals. Suddenly the political issue comes up that this was a project done by Hitler or this will lead to racism. And the political concerns don't allow us to really do scientific research or implement something which is scientific. So these are political aspects which forbid science and forbid the benefits to humanity. Then we look at economic aspects. We have the two extremes. Once upon a time, everything communist was published as good in the journals. Then we had everything capitalist good in the journals. And both of them have led to disasters in economic policy making. So we have paid a huge price. Entire countries have gone bankrupt. Entire societies have got destroyed because of this thing. Wrong economic generation because the gatekeepers are corrupt. And then you pass on this propaganda, this unilateral propaganda as knowledge and indoctrinate people. So this is a huge economic price. Then we come to the artistic area. In the artistic area also, unless you are extreme left of center, extremely individualistic and materialistic, it's very difficult to go ahead even in the artistic departments. So there is a huge price where unofficial censorship is already at work. And often the best of art does not come out. And then of course a spiritual price. Nobody is interested in scientific evaluation of spiritual practices, spiritual knowledge, because they fear it might come true. If there was no fear, they would be eagerly doing the research and proving it wrong. But the research is stifled because there is a fear that it will come true. And the irony is people who are spiritual themselves, they also have this fear, and their opponents also have this fear. And the opponents are actually more afraid than the real spiritual people who are interested in spirituality, that what if it comes true? So there is a huge spiritual price that we are also paying. So at every level, we are paying enormous price as a society and as individuals because of the limitations, the 4 limitations, and particularly the corruption.
We've discussed the limitations of science. So in that sense, when we talk about limitedness of science, is it not contrary to our belief of the omnipotence of science?
Right. So there is something which is called philosophy of science. And those who study philosophy in general and philosophy of science in particular, they are well conversant with limitations of science in many ways. Unfortunately, most people have not studied this area, so they think of science as omnipotent. So let us go into this aspect of limitedness of science and discuss certain points in this area on what are the limitations of various different types of science. Let us start with the philosophical limitation. Philosophically, there were two important philosophers who have talked about the limitations of science. The first philosopher was Immanuel Kant. Not the first philosophers, but the first philosopher who comes to my mind, let me put it that way. And Immanuel Kant talked about the limitation of science which comes about because of the limitations of the mind which does science. So he said that there is between the knower and the known, there is a kind of dynamic which makes it impossible to be sure that the knower can completely know the known. And he made this argument in this way, that I know about the entire world based upon the information I get from my senses. Now I have only 5 senses. What if there is something to reality which requires a 6th sense? For example, there are certain frequencies of sounds we can't hear, but other animals can hear. There are certain frequencies of light we can't see, but other animals can see. So because our senses don't report something does not mean it does not exist. So the idea there was, what if there is something to reality for which we don't have any sense? So somebody can say, okay, let us say there is a 6th sense which is required. But if I have 6 senses, I can still make the same question. What if a 7th is required? And this can go on till infinity. And at no point I can be sure that I have all the senses necessary to know all the aspects of reality. I can always have this doubt that there can be an aspect of reality for which I don't have any sense. So there is a limitation. And second limitation is the process of knowing. After the data is given to be, the mind processes it in a particular way. So there is a process of processing the data. And therefore, the instruments of collecting data and the system of processing data both have their limitations. And because of which absolute knowledge of the outer world is just not possible. We can never be sure that we have all the knowledge necessary of the outside world. So he said that there is a limitation to which we can know the outer world. So he put on the limitations of science. That science can never overleap experience, because science is known only through an experience of knowing. And in the experience of knowing, the senses and the processing system both are involved and both have limitations. So we can never say conclusively what the world actually is outside. We can only have a working hypothesis. So we can never know, as Immanuel Kant uses the words, thing in itself. We can only know the way the thing appears to us. But we can never say conclusively what the thing is into itself. So this he put in as a limitation of science and all human knowledge. That we can never know the thing in itself. We can only know as the thing appears to us and the processes it seems to follow. So this is one element of creating the unknowable and lack of certitude about the known. So this is one way of approaching philosophically the limitation of science. The second way of approaching is in a linguistic way. So another philosopher, Wittgenstein, he put forward the idea that thought requires language, and therefore the limits of language are the limits of thought. And the limits of thoughts naturally are the limits of science. So what cannot be known in the language, and if language has limitation per se of any kind, we would have a limitation of thought, and that would be a limitation of science also. So this brings us to the area of unknowable, that there are limits to our journey from the known to the unknown, and these limits can be of two types. It may be that the unknown is too big to be exhausted, and that would constitute a limitation of science, or that beyond the unknown is an unknowable, which would be an absolute limit to the science. So this is the philosophical aspect which brings out the limitedness of science. Okay. And then we have other limitations of science. For example, the limitation of the scientific method. That once we say that knowledge created by the using the scientific method is scientific knowledge, then the question comes, is the system of knowledge generation, the scientific method, is it actually foolproof, or does it have limitations? And obviously it has limitations. So there are many areas, for example, homeopathy, yoga, Ayurveda, pranic healing, Reiki. There are many sciences, the claims of which cannot be tested today using the method of science because we don't have the instruments for that. So the method of science itself has its own limitations conceptually and in terms of instrumentation. So that is second limitation, and therefore the inexact sciences remain inexact. They don't merge into the exact sciences, because given the time in which we live, there is limitation of the method of science, and therefore inexact sciences, crafts, arts, they exist as they are outside of exact sciences. The third element is the shelf life. The shelf life of scientific knowledge is very less. To prove something, you have to prove it every day, but to disprove something, one disproval is enough. So it said every law is a working hypothesis in perpetual fear of violation. And this is also a strength of science, that's always open to being disproved. And that's why we respect it so much. And that's why it progresses so fast. But the shelf life being very low is a limitedness of science. That also is an aspect of it. Then we come to the paradigm limitedness. So at every historical time, there is a paradigm of science. And if you have ideas outside of the paradigm, it's very difficult for science to accept it. And that is a limitation of science. Say, for example, 3 centuries back, if you had talked of energy and you had said that energy is a physical entity which exists but does not have mass and volume, people would have laughed at you, they would have called you psychotic. Because at that time, the idea was that only that thing exists which has mass and volume. If something does not have mass and volume, it cannot exist. But today we know energy exists and it does not have mass or volume. And there is a full power sector, which is a sector in economy. And hundreds of companies which are making millions of dollars by generating and selling energy, which does not have mass and volume. But this was inconceivable a few centuries back. Similarly, before Einstein, the fact that time can actually contract or expand or is related to space or matter is related to energy was inconceivable. So if you had produced papers in those times saying that mass and energy are related, the paper would be thrown out, never published. Because the gatekeepers and the world at large is itself in the grip of that paradigm of the time. So the practice of science is as much a social and psychological process as it is a scientific process. It is not pure science, absolutely. Right? In every historical time, people and gatekeepers of science are in grip of one particular paradigm. And much of the knowledge is rejected because it does not fit into that paradigm. Then we have the limitedness which is brought on by instruments. For example, if today you want to test whether string theory is correct or not correct, we just don't have instruments to generate so much of energy that string theory can be tested. So many people joke, this theory cannot be disproved because it cannot be tested. So is it a theory of science or is it philosophy? And this is true of many things. Many of the homeopathic concepts, pranic healing concepts, Reiki concepts, yogic concepts cannot be tested because we don't have instruments for that. So there is a very big limitedness of science, which comes from the limitedness of the instruments we have. And this gets into area of psychosomatic diseases. Right? This gets into area of sustainability of societies, how societies are degrading culturally or not on the path of cultural sustainability. And all of these are limitations. And another limitation is the horror of science, because no gun can fire only in one direction. So everything can be misused. That is a limitedness of science, that science has not been able to do anything related to human values and human intention. Human intention is still free from anything that science has manufactured. We don't have a tablet for anger or envy or domination. So science is good in producing capabilities, but till now it has not been efficient in producing anything related to human intention. And that creates a very big trouble because capabilities keep increasing and intentions are not purified. And then we have the perpetual limitation of science, that when we study a phenomena scientifically, on one side of the phenomena is the question of origin, and on the other side is the question of purpose. And science cannot deal with these two ultimate questions of origin and purpose. They are left to philosophy. Science can deal only between the in-between thing of the phenomena. The ultimate genesis and the ultimate purpose are all left for philosophy, and that's a very big limitedness of science. And then we have this whole zone of free will and what we call magic. And there again, we find the limitedness of science in understanding or influencing both these entities. In fact, I believe that when science progresses and we know more about these things, it may be possible that science may end up proving free will and magic.
We come to the end of our discussion, and thank you so much for make us see the science in a completely new light, in a new perspective. And I think all of us would start asking questions about definition of science, nature of science, limitedness of science, and scope of science, as you said, in the future. So the negative and the positive and the scope of science in future. So it's been very helpful.
I think if this talk of today can spark off a discussion in society, it would have served its purpose.
Yes. So thank you so much again. It was very enriching.
Yeah.
Do write to us at hvindia@gmail.com. Namaste.